The Emotion Eater, written and read by Ren Bryant. The stillness of the night hung heavy in the air, a tangible dread lurking in the shadows. The moon, shrouded behind a veil of clouds, offered only the faintest glow to the deserted streets of Ashford. A lone street lamp flickered at the corner of Elm and Maple, casting distorted shadows upon the pavement below. It was in this unsettling atmosphere that the Emotion Eater found pleasure, stalking his prey with a predator's patience. Jane Addams, a young nurse in her late 20s, hurried home from her night shift, unaware of the ominous figure trailing behind her. The Emotion Eater's eyes burned with anticipation as he watched her fumble for her keys, her breath condensing into a misty plume in the frosty air. As the door to her apartment creaked open, she hesitated for a moment, sensing something amiss, but ultimately shrugged it off as paranoia. Within the confines of her home, Jane failed to notice the subtle shift in energy, the way her cat, Mr. Whiskers, hissed and retreated beneath the sofa. But the Emotion Eater was there, in the darkest corners of the room, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Detective Sarah Matthews had a habit of chewing on the inside of her cheek, an unconscious gesture that only emerged when she was deep in thought. As she stood in her cramped office of the Ashford Police Department, she couldn't help but gnaw on her anxiety as she scrutinized the case files scattered across her desk. A series of unsolved murders had plagued the town in recent weeks, each victim discovered in a state of profound emotional emptiness. Empty husks of humanity who ultimately faded to death. The chief of police, a stout man with a bulbous red-tinged nose and a penchant for cigars, barged into Sarah's office, his face hot with frustration. "Matthews, what's the latest on these cases? The media's having a fucking field day with me and the mayor's breathing down my neck." Sarah sighed, her eyes fixed on the morose crime scene photos. "Nothing concrete yet, Chief. It's like this perp's a ghost, leaving nothing but drained shells of people behind." The chief grumbled, scratching on his stubbled chin. "Well, we better find something soon, or else we're all out of a job. I'll see if I can get you some more resources, but in the meantime, keep digging." As Jane settled onto her couch, the flickering light of the television casting an eerie glow across the room, the Emotion Eater made his move. He emerged from the shadows like a wraith, his ethereal form barely perceptible to the human eye, a swelling mass of darkness. Within this spectral figure, a translucent ashen face with glowing hollowed eyes and a crooked grin that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. His ghostly body was a constantly shifting, amorphous shape that seemed to defy the laws of physics, making it difficult to focus on him for any extended period of time. As he moved, whispers of despair and anguish trailed behind him, leaving behind an oppressive chill in the air that clawed its ways down the spine of the unsuspecting, instilling a sense of inescapable dread. Before Jane could even comprehend the danger she was in, the Emotion Eater's cold spectral fingers reached out and pressed against her temples. The connection was instantaneous, and Jane's body went rigid as unseen forces began to siphon away her fear, her sadness, and her joy. Cold sweat dribbled down her forehead, her eyes stared wide but did not see, and her lips moved but no scream escaped. The Emotion Eater devoured it all. The creature reveled in the sensations of her emotions flowing into him, each one a delicacy to savor and indulge. Sarah was on her way home when the call came in, her police radio cracking to life with a sense of urgency. "All units, we've got a possible 1031 in progress at 27 Maple Street, apartment 4B. Caution is advised." Her heart pounding, Sarah flipped on the siren and sped towards the address, her instincts screaming that this might be the break they finally needed. As she pulled up to the apartment building, She saw other squad cars already on the scene, their lights casting a dire red and blue glow on the facade. She rushed towards the apartment, her hand on the gun holstered to her side, and she found a small team of officers preparing to breach the door. She nodded at them, and with a well-rehearsed efficiency, they burst through. The scene that greeted them was one of horror and confusion. Jane sat on the couch, her eyes vacant, a thin trail of blood dripping from her nose. The emotion eater was still there, his spectral form caught off guard by the sudden intrusion. The room seemed to vibrate with a mystical energy, as if reality itself was being torn asunder. With the snarl of rage, the emotion eater released Jane and retreated into the shadows, vanishing just as quickly as he appeared. Sarah and the other officers caught something out of the corner of their eyes, something dark and shapeless like a thundercloud that was there one moment and gone the next. As they stared at the empty space, they realized they had just witnessed something truly inexplicable. Sarah and the Flatfoot secured the apartment and called for an ambulance, but as they examined Jane, it became clear that this was no ordinary victim. She matched the other victims they had found recently. Her pulse was weak, her body cold and unresponsive, but her eyes were the most unsettling part. They were devoid of any emotion or life. As they waited for the paramedics, Sarah tried to make sense of what she had just seen. The black cloud of the emotion eater haunted her thoughts. The image of his spectral form burned into her memory. She knew in her gut that whatever this thing was, it was the key to solving the recent string of murders. There was nothing else except the paranormal that could explain what happened to the victims. But how could she hope to catch a creature that seemed to exist beyond the realm of human understanding? Later that night, Sarah sat at her desk, her fingers absently tracing the outlines of her badge. Fear and confusion gnawed at the edges of her mind. She knew she needed help, but who could she turn to? Who could possibly believe the thing she had witnessed? And then, like a lightning bolt, a name came to her. Daniel Keats, the psychic medium who had helped the department with a missing person case a few years back. Sarah didn't know if he truly could communicate with the spirit world, but she was desperate enough to try anything. With a deep breath, she picked up the phone and dialed his number. Daniel Keats had a disheveled appearance that did little to inspire confidence. His dark hair was a mess, and his clothes hung off his lanky frame in a haphazard fashion. And yet, there was something in his eyes that seemed to hint at the supernatural abilities he claimed to possess. Sarah met with him at a small out-of-the-way coffee shop, the smell of roasting beans and the murmur of conversation providing a comforting backdrop to the uneasy alliance. As they sipped on their drinks, she explained the situation, her voice wavering as she recounted her experience with the emotion eater. "I know it sounds crazy," she said, her fingers tapping nervously on the table, "but I've got a gut feeling that this creature, this thing's behind the murders. What's happening to these people before they perish, the way they're basically just empty bodies? I don't know how or why, but I need your help, Daniel. You're the only one I can think of who might understand what we're dealing with here." Daniel's expression darkened, his forehead creasing with concern as he pondered over the statement. "I'm a simple medium, Sarah. I've dealt with spirits and energy connections, but I've never encountered anything like what you're describing. But I'm willing to try and help. If there's a way to communicate with the victims or trace the spirit's energy, I'll do my best to find it." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Daniel worked relentlessly to unravel the mystery of the emotion eater. As they delved deeper into the case, they began to uncover a pattern in the emotion eater's choice of victims. Each one was targeted during a moment of intense emotional vulnerability. A woman grieving for the loss of her child, a man crushed by the weight of his own guilt. Daniel surmised that the creature seemed to feed off their pain, their fears, and their despair, leaving them hollow shells of their former selves. But with each new revelation came more questions. The mystery of the Emotion Eater's origins and motives still frustratingly out of reach. Was he a vengeful spirit, a demonic force, or something else entirely? And how could they possibly stop him from claiming more victims? Daniel suggested they try something else. He advised they visit Jane at the hospital, and with his psychic abilities, he could try to establish a connection to Jane's consciousness, maybe discover a tether between her and the Emotion Eater. When they arrived, they found her condition unchanged, her eyes still hauntingly vacant. Daniel took her hand and focused his energy. He said she was in there. He could feel it, though it was a weak connection, and in her current state, he said he couldn't get anything from her. One evening, as they sat in the low light of Daniel's apartment, surrounded by stacks of books on the occult and the paranormal, Sarah opened up about her past. She spoke of her father, a detective who had died on the job when she was a teenager, and how his memory had driven her to join the force and seek justice for those who could no longer speak for themselves. Daniel listened intently, his eyes filled with empathy and understanding. "I think that's why we make a good team, Sarah," he said quietly. "We've both experienced loss. I lost my partner, and in the anguish of mourning him, I discovered my psychic abilities. I think our pain has given us the strength to face the unknown. We know that fear can't hold us back, not when there's lives at stake." And so they pressed on, their determination to stop the Emotion Eater only growing stronger with each passing day. The Emotion Eater, however, was far from idle. He continued to stalk the streets of Ashford, his insatiable hunger for human emotion driving him to even more reckless acts. The creature claimed 2 more victims, a woman who had just failed her bar exam and a child whose daddy was killed by a drunk driver. And as the Emotion Eater's powers grew, so too did his awareness of the 2 investigators who sought to unmask him. With a perverted sense of amusement, he began to leave cryptic messages next to his victims, taunting Sarah and Daniel and daring them to uncover his secrets. One morning, Sarah arrived at a new crime scene to find a chilling message scrawled across the wall in what appeared to be blood. "You can't save them all, detective." Her heart pounded like a jackhammer, the cold sweat beading on her brow as her hand instinctively reached for her holstered gun. It was clear that the Emotion Eater was not only aware of their investigation, but was also watching them closely. The situation took an even darker turn when Daniel received an anonymous package, the contents of which left him pale and shaken. Inside, he found a small leather-bound journal, the pages filled with the names and dates of the Emotion Eater's victims. But there, at the bottom of the list, was a name that made his knees weak, his own sister Emily. As they struggled to process the implications of the Emotion Eater's actions, Sarah and Daniel realized that they were no longer merely hunting a monster. They were now the hunted. They knew that with each passing day, the danger grew closer, and their friends and loved ones would become unwitting pawns in the Emotion Eater's morbid game. Desperate to find a way to stop the Emotion Eater, Sarah and Daniel turned to an unlikely source for help. Jane, the woman whose near-death experience had first led them to the creature's trail. Though still trapped in her catatonic state, Jane's connection to the Emotion Eater offered a unique opportunity to learn more about the creature's abilities and weaknesses. Daniel, using his psychic powers, attempted to establish a deeper connection with Jane's consciousness, hoping to glean some insight into the Emotion Eater's methods. At first, the connection was tenuous, the void in Jane's mind a disorienting and terrifying place. But gradually, the fragments of her memory began to coalesce, revealing glimpses of the Emotion Eater's true nature. What they discovered was both horrifying and enlightening. The Emotion Eater was not simply an evil spirit or a demonic force, but rather a manifestation of the darkness that dwelled within the human psyche. He was a creature born of pain, fear, and despair, his existence sustained by the very emotions he consumed. The information was the break they needed. Sarah and Daniel devised a risky plan to trap the Emotion Eater. They would use Jane as bait, her lingering connection to the creature serving as a lure to draw him out of hiding. It was a gamble that would either save lives or result in their own destruction. As the final pieces of their plan fell into place, Sarah and Daniel braced themselves for the imminent face-off that loomed before them. The gravity of their burdens pressed down on them, the fates of their dear friends and family members precariously hanging by a thread. Yet, in spite of the dread that nibbled at the periphery of their thoughts, they discovered comfort in each other's presence, their mutual ordeals solidifying a connection that refused to shatter. United, they would confront the darkness and do battle for the quintessential core of human existence, the emotions that shape them in both their splendor and their misery. With the encroaching shadows of the night unfurling around them, Sarah and Daniel stepped forward into the unknown, ready to confront the Emotion Eater and bring an end to his reign of terror once and for all. They spent days preparing for their showdown, consulting with exorcists and other psychics in an effort to strengthen their own abilities. As the night of the confrontation arrived, an uneasy tension hung in the air, like a storm waiting to break. They decided to use an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town as the site of their trap, the desolate location providing a fitting stage for their final confrontation. Daniel drew a magic circle in the dirt ground, what he said would be a protective barrier against evil spirits. He placed Jane at the center of the circle, her fragile body bound by a shroud with the names of the divine. Then they waited for the Emotion Eater to take the bait. As the hours crawled by, Sarah couldn't help but feel her nerves fraying, the oppressive darkness of the warehouse and the uncertainty of their plan chomping at her resolve. She paced the dirt floor, her footsteps sending up dust, her hand never strayed far from her holstered gun. Daniel, meanwhile, sat in quiet meditation, his focus directed inward as he prepared himself for the psychic battle that lay ahead. His face was a mask of concentration, his eyes closed and his breath steady. But Sarah knew that beneath his calm exterior, he too was wrestling with his own fears. Finally, as the moon reached its zenith in the night sky, a shiver of cold dread washed over them, the temperatures in the warehouse plummeting as the Emotion Eater rode in on noxious winds, his shadowy form arriving like a storm. His presence came alive, twisting and writhing like an earthworm, shimmering with an eerie blue light. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at the eyes of the monster that had haunted her dreams, a warped reflection of the darkness that lay within her human soul. She could feel his power, the raw energy that radiated from his form like a heat wave, but she refused to let her fear control her. "Your reign of terror ends tonight, you son of a bitch," she growled, her voice filled with determination as she leveled her gun at the Emotion Eater. "We know what you are, and we know how to stop you." "You think you can stop me with a gun?" the Emotion Eater sneered, his voice oozing malice. Within his ball of shadows, a razor-toothed grin emerged. "I am the darkness within you all. Your fear and despair gives me life. You cannot destroy me." Daniel, his eyes still closed, spoke up, his voice steady and unwavering. "That may be true, but we can sever the connection to this world to stop you from continuing to feed on the pain of your victims." The shadows of the Emotion Eater lunged towards Jane, ghostly hands outstretched to reclaim his prize. But as he entered the magic circle, a barrier of shimmering light sprang up around her, repelling the creature's advance and sending him backwards with a howl of frustration. Sarah and Daniel seized their chance, their voices joining together as they began the incantation that would sever the Emotion Eater's connection to his victims. The warehouse shook with the force of their words, the very air cackling with power as they tapped into a wellspring of energy that had lain dormant within them for years. The Emotion Eater fought back, his rage and hatred fueling a desperate attempt to reclaim what had been taken from him. He threw his shadowy mass against the barrier surrounding Jane, his spectral form flickering and distorting like a candle flame in a storm. In the face of his seething rage, the Emotion Eater found himself unable to overpower the amalgamated might of Sarah and Daniel. Their unwavering resolve and determination melded together, forging an insoluble bond that defied fracture. As the incantation swelled to an ear-splitting climax, an all-consuming burst of radiance detonated from the heart of the magic circle, its explosive force hurling the Emotion Eater backwards. In that split second, Sarah and Daniel grasped the magnitude of their triumph. The insidious ties that had once shackled the Emotion Eater to his prey had been separated, liberating their souls from his clutches. His power dwindled, his ghostly image quivering and decaying like the final glowing remnants of a dying fire. Uttering a guttural, tormented wail, the Emotion Eater dissolved into the inky darkness, signaling the conclusion of his dreaded reign. The warehouse was abruptly enveloped in silence, the stifling miasma of terror and desolation dissipating like morning mist under the sun's gentle embrace. Exhausted but triumphant, Sarah and Daniel collapsed to the ground, their hands clasping tightly as they shared a moment of quiet relief. They had faced the darkness together and emerged victorious. As they recovered their strengths, they noticed that Jane's eyes had begun to flutter, the first signs of life returning to her previously catatonic form. As she slowly regained consciousness, a look of confusion and wonder crossed her face, as though she was seeing the world for the first time. What happened?" she whispered, her voice weak but filled with a tentative hope. "Where am I?" Sarah and Daniel exchanged a glance, their eyes shining with unspoken emotion as they realized the true scope of their victory. Not only had they defeated the Emotion Eater, but they also had managed to save Jane, giving her a second chance at life. "You're safe now," Sarah reassured her, her hand gently squeezing Jane's. "We defeated the monster that was feeding off your emotions. It's over." As the sun began to rise, casting a warm glow over the horizon, Sarah, Daniel, and Jane emerged from the warehouse, their faces etched with scars of battle, but their spirits lifted by their hard-won victory. Together they walked towards a new day, their lives forever changed by the encounter with darkness. In the months that followed, Sarah and Daniel continued to work together, using their newfound abilities and experiences to help others who found themselves facing the unknown. As for Jane, she slowly rebuilt her life, her strength and resilience evidence of the power that is the human spirit. With the support of Sarah and Daniel, she learned to confront her fears and embrace the emotions that had once been stolen from her, finding comfort in the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her struggle. And while the Emotion Eater had been defeated, they knew that there were other monsters lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance to prey on the vulnerable and weak. But Sarah, Daniel, and Jane had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. They had learned that while darkness may dwell within the human soul, so too did light, and it was this light that would guide them through the darkest of nights, a beacon of hope shining brightly amidst the shadows of fear and despair.